Thank you. I appreciate it, Senator.
I'd like to have another conversation offline about the penny plan, because I don't see the math in that yet.
Okay.
But,
I'll prove it to you, Senator.
no, I'd love to see that, honestly. I respect
Okay.
what all you guys are doing, because I got to tell you, if you want to know what's going on in the presidential election, it starts right here in this conversation. Whether you believe in a balanced budget law or not, you've got to have an agreement. This is not a partisan conversation. It should not be. This is the crisis of our time. It's our crisis. It's here, and it affects the other crisis. That's the global security crisis. We're at a point right now where I believe our intransigence on the financial side is causing us great stress in terms of defending our country and leading in the world relative to the threats that are facing global security today. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Budget Committee, and these two things are no longer separate. These two crises are interlocked in a way that they've never been. There was always been defense hawks and budget hawks. You don't have that, we don't have that luxury anymore. It's all tied together. Then you've got the idea of the entitlement, the Social Security and the Medicare. We don't solve this crisis without coming to grips with those. And it doesn't have to be draconian. You want to see draconian, do nothing. Do nothing. Now you got draconian. That draconian, and I'm leading to a question about the dollar and reserve currency. I want to get there, but I want to call out some things I've heard today. This is what drives people back home absolutely crazy. We talk about percentage of GDP. We talk about one side wants spending cuts, the other side wants revenue. Well, here's the reality in my mind. Last year, we collected almost $3.4 trillion in revenue. That's an all-time record. The year before was an all-time record. But here's the problem. In the year 2000, we spent $2.4 trillion running the federal government. Last year, we spent almost $3.8 trillion. That's constant dollars. Now, you say, well, percentage of GDP. Well, wait a minute. The federal government never talks about fixed expenses and variable expenses. That's another conversation I'd like to have offline. In business, you have to talk about that. If you give up your leverage of growth, then you'll be out of business very, very quickly because your competitor is getting leverage on that growth. We don't do that. The next thing, in the last 100 years, we've had three political supermajorities. The first gave us a New Deal, the second, the Great Society, and the third, Obamacare and Dodd-Frank. Now, I'm a business guy. I look at it very simply. I can put at the feet of those three supermajorities a lot of the responsibility for this financial catastrophe right now. And the irony is, I think we've proven that some of these sweeping federal programs have failed. The poverty rate today is exactly the same as it was in 1965 when the great war on poverty was started. You can shake your head, but the numbers are there. So, the reality is that these federal programs don't fail. Trillions of dollars. The bottom line is there are four words that I don't hear in Washington ever. We cannot afford it. So then the question is, if you can't afford it, then you've got to get in and start allocating to priorities, and we don't do that here. Both sides are guilty. No, there are no innocent parties. In 2000, we had $6 trillion of debt. In 2008, we had $10 trillion. Now we got $19 trillion. In the next 10 years, you just showed it, Mr. Moore, we're going to add another $9 trillion to $19 trillion. If nothing is done today, current law says that we'll borrow another $9 trillion. In the last 7 years, 35% of what we spend as a federal government has been borrowed. The reality of that is, up to now, the last 7 years, every dollar we spend on discretionary, every dollar we spend on the military, every dollar we spend on entitlements, non-military discretionary, every dime on foreign aid is borrowed technically. Now, that brings us to a whole new level of conversation. Somebody said it, without a balanced budget law, and by the way, 44 states, and if you want to see where government works, go to your local state. In most cases, all but maybe 4 or 5, financially, it's working. They understand how to control their spending, they understand their own local economy. I would argue this, and I'm leading to a question. The budget system is broken. It's only worked 4 times in the last 40 years. Dr. Holsekin, you've testified to that. Mr. Moore, you guys have said that for years. The question I have, Mr. Moore, I'd love to have you start and just help me with this. Great Britain sat here 100 years ago, and they were in a very similar situation, and they ignored it, and they ignored it, and they ignored it, and they lost the pound as a reserve currency, and we saw what happened to their ability to borrow after that. I'd like you to address the danger. Is that a real danger now? Is this something we need to be concerned with? I would argue that this crisis is already here. The tipping point was when, I don't know when it was, but if interest rates right now, and you've all talked about it, if they go back to their 30-year averages somewhere around 5% of $1 trillion, that'd be $1 trillion in interest on a $20 trillion debt. That's just not manageable. That's twice what we spend on our military. So the question I have is, have we not already gotten to the point where we're threatening the dollar as a reserve currency?
Well, I hope not. I think we greatly benefit as a nation from being the world reserve currency, and I don't think it's an immediate danger. What worries me is that if people lose confidence in our finances, what are they going to do when you issue more debt? They're going to, we got into this before, they're going to charge you higher interest rates to borrow. And it's we talked about this issue of financial crises. And I remember the 2008 crisis. It happened overnight, almost literally overnight. I mean, I remember one weekend talking to people who worked at Bear Stearns. I said, I hear you got a margin call. You might, oh, no. And the next weekend, they're out of business. I mean, that was a multi-billion-dollar company. So these things can happen in a flash, and nobody's prepared for them. And I go back to what I said before. The fiscally prudent thing to do is to lower the risk of that happening. And why not start now?
So, Dr. Holtz, talk to me about I've heard testimony today relative to the impact that a balanced budget law, and by the way, that math is not, there's no way that you can institute a balanced budget next year.
Right.
I mean, it's just not going to happen. Last year we fought and put a budget out that balanced in theory in 9 years, but we waived it late in the year and we ended up with an omnibus. So what we're trying to do now is to redo that process that's broken. The question I have for you is what was said earlier today in testimony that somehow this balanced budget requirement would impact the normal ebbs and flows of the economy. Would you address that?
Yeah. So the theory is that the Congress and Washington in general can somehow manage the economy by cutting taxes, raising spending during downturns, and raising taxes, cutting spending during recoveries. I'll point out the latter never happens. So the sort of theory is not something we should ever pretend we're implementing. Second point about that is it's not like it's working, okay? There's a terrible track record of doing this in a timely fashion. The idea that somehow it's going to take time to get the supermajority and move, it's always too late historically anyway. Discretionary fiscal policy doesn't work. A better way to think about it is the way we came to a consensus as a profession in the 1980s, where fiscal policy was set for long-term growth purposes, and the number one growth threat right now is, in fact, the debt. So, this would be setting fiscal policy on a trajectory that promotes long-term growth, and then you let monetary policy take care of any near-term recessionary tendencies. By and large, the Federal Reserve and the fiscal policy did very well in the 80s and 90s. And then that consensus broke down, right? And you saw 2001, post 9/11, Bush administration. You saw 2002, 2003, 2005, 2008, the Bush administration checks. 2009, the Recovery Act. Again and again and again, on a bipartisan basis, we gave up this sort of compact to set fiscal policy for long-term growth, let the monetary policy take care of short-term fluctuations. What have we gotten for that? Bad growth.
I want to thank all of you again. Regardless of your perspective, I think please stay engaged with us. I think there's a growing sense in this Congress that in a bipartisan way, this is our crisis right now. We've got to move on it, and we need people like you to help us. Thank you for your testimony.